Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out so early. Thanks very much to the organizers for putting me on the program for this. I'm honored to be speaking in this venue. Okay, so my topic today is upgrading by firms in developing countries. I realize I inadvertently kept you in suspense by not putting the title in the program, but that's the topic. But by upgrading, what I mean is innovative behavior in a broader than usual sense. Okay, so innovation, often when people talk about innovation, in the field of innovation economics, is usually about new to the world stuff. Okay, so and they rely heavily on, for empirical measures, on patents and R&D spending. That's obviously less relevant in less developed countries, typically firms in less developed countries, although you do sometimes see patents and you see R&D in the data. For the most part, they're aiming to catch up to the world frontier, not push it forward. And so those measures of R&D and patenting that we see are arguably less informative. In this context, I like the word upgrading very much. It encompasses both this new to the world innovation and catch-up innovation. Okay? Now, but that's going to have implications for how we measure it. We don't have quite the obvious measures that we'd have if we're just talking about new to the world stuff. Now, you'd think that adopting a technology that already exists would be much easier than inventing a new one. Gershon Kron, back in 1962, famously referred to this as one of the advantages of backwardness. It's somewhat non-PC terminology, but anyway, a useful concept, I think. But for many firms, and I think I'll just assert that, I think there's probably wide agreement here, those advantages have remained elusive. There are some firms that have caught up quickly, but there are many that seem to struggle with the catch-up process. And so my question for today, and for the sort of research that I and a bunch of other people have been working on is what's getting in the way? What's the problem? Anytime you identify a barrier, you're implicitly sort of making a causal statement. You're implicitly also identifying a driver of upgrading, just if only by mitigating that barrier. And so I can restate this in a positive way and say, what are the drivers of upgrading at the firm level? This to me seems like a first order question for development. It's hard for me to imagine sustained increases in living standards in the absence of such firm level upgrading. I think it's also fair to say that this was not a focus of the development economics community for many years. It was there at the start of the field of development, but that for many years it was not a core topic outside of agriculture. I should qualify that. In agriculture it was, but not so much in manufacturing or non-agriculture. One illustration that was salient to me was that I was in grad school, and Pranab Bardhan, who's an advisor of mine, and Chris Utri put out this readings in empirical development economics that had there's nothing in there with firm level data. And there was a sort of apologetic paragraph saying, we realize that this seems to be happening. Eventually we hope to, the next round of this will include some papers with firm level data, but it took a while for that to happen. I think it's an interesting question. We don't talk a lot about intellectual history often, but I think it's an interesting question about why is that? Why is it that there wasn't this focus on firms? Some possible answers. I think, and even as micro-empirical work and development took off, why wasn't there? So one reason is that firm level data, is hard to come by. It was hard to come by, certainly. It was only in the early 90s, I guess, that sort of micro data on firms and panel data on firms started becoming available. It's still much more costly to access firm level data than it is to access many other types of data sets. I think another important reason is just there was such a strong reaction against import substituting industrialization, interventionist development policy, which was then codified in the Washington Consensus policies. That sort of broke the link between policymakers who are out there and have continued actually to do industrial policy, right, and researchers. Industrial policy became such sort of bad word in academic circles that there wasn't a lot of work, and so there wasn't much, the sort of connective tissue between researchers and policymakers and implementers of that research was broken. And so there hasn't been a natural policy audience for this kind of work. I think that's changing, but it's been somewhat slow. And then I think a third reason, which we don't often talk about, I think it's important, is that there's a perception that it's quite challenging to do work that's credible by modern applied micro standards on firms. It's very costly to run experiments. Outcomes are hard to measure well. I'm going to talk a fair amount about that. Firms don't have a lot of fixed characteristics. What X's would you control for to increase precision of your estimates? It's not clear. Okay, and partly as a consequence, I say a lot of this firm level work was not considered part of development. It was done by, certainly when it was starting out, as mainly people, trade or in macro or in IO, and not so much in development. So some messages I'm going to try and communicate today. One is, I think some of that skepticism around point 3 about hard to do credible work is actually justified. So I'll talk about some of the outcomes that, TFP is the standard outcome that most people still use to measure upgrading. It has lots of problems. I think those problems are underappreciated outside of the TFP literature, and so I'm going to talk about some of them. But I guess my bigger message is that a lot of progress has been made. It's now a quite active area. There's lots of work going on that I think is quite credible and should be, is credible by modern applied micro standards. People are using direct measures of upgrading rather than what I call residual-based measures like TFP, which I'll come back to. There are more increasingly numbers of experiments and quasi-experiments. We shouldn't forget about quasi-experiments. And I think there are some robust lessons emerging from this literature. There are also some lessons that appear to be emerging that are not quite so robust, and I'll try and highlight those if time permitting. And I guess also part of my message here is that I think this is quite fertile ground for development researchers, right? There's cost to leaving this work to people in trade and macro and IO. So my best friends are trade macro. I'm often considered trade macro and IO, among other fields. Why do I think this is fertile ground for development researchers? The questions are very important. The data frontier is expanding rapidly. There's increasing support from policymakers and firms and funders for running experiments. And I think that the development community's traditional focus on paying shoe leather costs to get the right data and on understanding the context are actually crucial. Okay, and that's especially when we move away from sort of residual-based measures like productivity to actual direct measures of upgrading. We really have to understand what's going on in these industries. And so I think actually this crowd, the development crowd, is the crowd that really, or I'd like to encourage people in this crowd to work on these topics. So I have a new review coming out in the Journal of Economic Literature. I'm going to rely heavily on that in this talk. Anytime you do a review like this, you have to focus things pretty drastically. So I'm going to focus on non-micro, non-agricultural firms, and then within firm upgrading, not allocation of resources across firms. Misallocation is obviously a hugely important topic. There's lots of work. I'm going to leave it aside. I can't do everything. Okay. So roadmap. So I'm going to talk a fair amount about sort of what do I mean by upgrading more precisely. I'm going to give a conceptual framework to kind of fix ideas and give us a notation, and then talk about some of those measurement issues I discussed. And then I'm going to talk about evidence on drivers of upgrading, motivated by the framework. Motivated by the framework, I'll classify them in three categories: output side, input side, and drivers of know-how, and then some closing thoughts. Okay, so here's a framework. It's going to be frustrating to you because there's no falsifiable predictions. It's very general, but I think it's useful to have a notation, and there are some conceptual points that I think come out of it. Okay, and I want to start by going down to a quite micro level. Think about a production function at the firm I, product J, technique K, year T level. Okay, so now, a firm is only going to choose one technique at a time, but it has a choice among a menu of techniques. Okay, and then, so that's just to say output is going to depend on a vector of inputs, which might be specific to the K. The technique you're using will determine which inputs you need. And then this lambda thing, you think of this as capability. Okay, or Sutton calls it capability. And a key point about that is it has to, in some sense, be homegrown. That's Bob Gibbons' term. Wouter Hussain and Andrea Pratt have a recent paper arguing this, that you can't just go out and buy capability on the market. If you could, then arguably it should go in the M. Okay, so the capability is something that has to be developed internally in your firm. I'm just going to think of different quality outputs and inputs as having different J's or being different elements of that M vector. I'm going to use this phi as product quality. It's a single dimensional. It's very drastic simplification to say that it's a single dimension will describe all heterogeneity and quality. But bear with me. I think that a lot of the key ideas in the literature can be expressed with that. Okay, and then think of big J and big K as the sets of products and techniques that the firm knows about, to which the firm knows this F function. Okay, and then I'm going to do this capital lambda as the set of all those product technique specific capability terms, and J and K together. I'm going to call that know-how. All right, just to save time. All right, more basically notation, but we can think about different destination markets. There's a bunch of fixed costs that could be incurred at various different levels. Firms can invest in their know-how, so in their capabilities and their knowing about products, knowing about techniques. That's costly. Those are costly investments. And then I'm just going to model this as, in a very general way, firms face an inverse output demand curve, right? But it's characterized in the relationship between, let's see if so between output in a market, of product J and in market B, relate that to the price in that market. Depends, that's going to, how much, what the demand is going to depend on the quality, and then some exogenous, external to the firm shifters. You can think about an inverse input supply curve also, right? So that that's going to relate the prices of inputs to this vector of inputs. Okay, and so then the firm's problem is to maximize the present discounted value of profits. So there's a lot of procedure, but you're summing up over future periods. That's a discount factor. This is summing over the set of markets that the firm decides to enter. This is the products that it decides to produce. That's revenues. That's variable costs. You got a bunch of fixed costs, and then also these investments. Okay, and so the firm's has to choose the destinations, the products. They have to choose a technique for each product they decide to produce. They've got inputs, and then these investments. Okay, all right, so as I said, that was, I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to try and derive any predictions, but I think it's useful, certainly useful for defining terms and for the four main ways that I think upgrading has been defined in the literature. Okay, so one would be learning. I think of learning as gains of know-how. So that would be gains of lambdas. So it could be all lambdas or it could be some subset of lambdas. Also knowledge of products and knowledge of techniques. Quality upgrading would be an increase in the average quality, this average quality fee bar. That's just an output weighted average of all the fees. Product innovation would be producing a product which hasn't been produced by the firm before. Okay. Technology adoption would be using a technique that hasn't been used by the firm before. Now, one would be sort of tempted to say technology adoption would be adoption of a new or better technique, but I'm going to argue that we don't really have a good ranking of techniques, right? So I'm just going to say technology adoption is just be any new technology. Okay, so what's one point I think that comes out already is that these dimensions are related. They often go together. Firms that are upgrading on one dimension often upgrade on other dimensions, but they don't have to. Right? You could have quality upgrading without product innovation just by shifting, say, the weights between pre-existing qualities. You could have technology adoption without learning. It could be that you knew about this product already, you just happen not to choose it. Okay, and you can go through all four that have that characteristic. Okay, so maybe a bigger point that comes out of this is that LDC firms face different conditions than firms in rich countries. Okay, they're typically going to face different product demand curves. So, for example, they're often facing poorer consumers than firms are in rich countries. They're poorer consumers who are less willing to pay for quality. That's obviously going to affect quality choices. They're going to face different input supply curves and prices. So that's going to, for instance, high quality inputs or high skilled workers are often relatively expensive in poor countries, and that may affect also the choice of what inputs you use and what outputs to produce. And they're going to have different levels of know-how, which is costly to acquire. Okay, so related to that, upgrading may or may not be optimal for firms. Okay, there's a nice quote here. This is from a review by Foster and Rosenzweig on microeconomics of technology adoption, largely focused on agricultural technology adoption. But basically, you can't look out and say, okay, farms that are using fertilizer are more profitable than farms that are not using fertilizer, to say everybody should use fertilizer. Right? It depends on the conditions that they face. So it's not going to be the same technology is not going to be good for everybody. Now, know-how. Having more know-how is better than having less know-how. That's clear. That's unambiguously good for firms. But if know-how is costly to acquire, then it's not obvious that firms should be investing that know-how. Depends on the costs and the benefits. Okay, so that's one point. Second point. So there's a lot of discussion now, and I think rightly so, about management, especially management in firms in developing countries. Now, in the context of this framework, I think we can understand what people mean when they say management in three different ways. One is management would be sort of know-how, including entrepreneurial ability, okay, sort of the inherent quality of the entrepreneur, okay. So you can think of entrepreneurial ability as sort of a lambda that applies for all different product techniques. Okay, so that's one definition of management. Another would be the skill of the employed manager, so not just the entrepreneur, but the people that the firm is employing, and that's a purchased input. And then in a third way, you can think of management practices. But now I want to think of, and I think there's some fuzziness on this in the literature, I want to think of management practices R, a K. That's part of the technique that firms are choosing based on their know-how and based on the conditions that they're facing. Okay? So when I say that, I'm in good company in thinking of it that way. So John Van Rienen, and this is the working paper version of the India consulting experiment, saying you should think of these practices like any other technique. Okay? But it's not always thought about that in the literature. Okay, and then immediately a question arises related to this, is whether these practices can be ranked. There's a long history of this debate in the management literature. One view is typically labeled the vertical view, which is the view that I think these guys who are leading, John and Nick and others, leading contributors to this literature, would say some practices are better than others. And the claim is, if you think in the context of this framework, the claim is that's true across contexts, right? So that that profit of using a technique K is higher than the product of using technique K prime for all output demand, input supply, and levels of know-how and knowledge about products. Okay, so that's the vertical claim. The other sort of countering claim would be the horizontal or contingency view, which also has a long history, basically saying which is best depends on the context. So I have the luxury of, as I've just written the review paper, you can go back and find the cites to Woodward and also to others who are and the Desane and Pratt also relates to this. But basically it depends. It's very context specific. What's the right practice? So it's ultimately an empirical question, right? Are some practices better across all contexts? It hasn't been resolved. I don't think we know. I think that we need more evidence on that. I will say though, and this is probably somewhat controversial, but I will say that, so normally if we look out at not management techniques, we look at normal technologies, okay, and you look at and you see firms are using different technologies, you don't immediately assume one's making a mistake and one's doing it correctly. Right? What you say is, I wonder what are the conditions that the firm is facing that's leading to use these different technologies. Okay, and so I think that point can sometimes be lost. We should keep it in mind. Okay, so that's I'm going to come back to this the framework and the notation as we go. So now, if we think about those four definitions of upgrading, now let's think about how people have tried to capture this empirically. Okay, so there are patents and R&D expenditures. As I said, it's typically related to new to the world stuff, not new to the firm, and also and they're unlikely to capture catch-up. Also, this is a paper Daniel, he's in the et al. I say this as someone who's also often in the et al. But it's a nice paper showing that R&D expenditures are manipulable. In China, they incentivize R&D expenditures, and the people relabeled a lot of other expenditures as R&D. So arguably, the patents and R&Ds are not that useful. The main thing, I'd say the predominant measure that people use is TFP. So there has conceptual advantages to trying to estimate TFP. That's aiming at directly estimating this lambda, or typically you make some assumptions that the lambdas are the same across products, but you're trying to get at that lambda. So that's a plus. So conceptually it's a plus. The minus is that the methods require quite strong assumptions and have various biases, and I'm gonna take some time to talk about those. Then I think that what to me is the more encouraging movement is to use direct measures of some of the other dimensions of upgrading, quality upgrading, product innovation, technology adoption, which would be including management practices. So there are a couple of minuses there. One is, as I said, that it's not necessarily optimal to see upgrading on those dimensions, right? So you can't really say if someone's not doing that, you can't say that they're somehow not doing well. Another minus is that typically you can only observe them in particular sectors where you've done the work to collect this information. But the big plus is that you don't require the same strong theoretical assumptions. Okay, and so I think that that we're sort of it'll come later also. But I think a good way forward is to try and start building up slowly from particular sectors where we observe these things, rather than sort of asserting that across sectors I have a measure that's useful. Okay, Mushfik. So I will talk about competition. I'm sort of burying them into these output demand. Where do they go? Output demand, input supply curves. So basically everything's going to be in there, right? So the question was what about general equilibrium stuff and outside the firm stuff and competition, et cetera? Are you just focused on firms? And obviously those things are very important. It's just that in the framework I'm just burying them in these output demand and input supply curves, right? And those capital gamuts, which is like all the external to firm stuff that might be shifting. So I don't want to ignore them. It was just a sort of a shorthand way of burying this. Okay. Okay, where was I? Yeah. Okay, and then there is a literature basically using kind of residual-based measures to try and infer quality. I'm going to talk less about that. I'm more excited about the direct measures. Okay, so TFP. Let me try and do this quickly. I'm conscious of time, but I'll try and communicate sort of the basic issues. The first couple of these are quite familiar. The third one may be less familiar. Okay, so a standard thing to do in the TFP literature was to write down a Cobb-Douglas production function. You get capital, labor's material. You got the coefficients. You have a ex-ante shock that the firm observes before it chooses inputs, and then an ex-post shock which comes afterwards. The problem is that firms may look, they wake up, see that they're more productive, decide to use more inputs, and that will induce a bias, a variables bias there, which people have tried to deal with. The dominant strategy is what's we call a proxy variable strategy, which is essentially to say, okay, if there's a monotonic relationship between, let's see if I can do this, between, say, capital and that omega, that ex-ante shock, and investment, okay, then you can invert that investment demand equation, okay, and then you can proxy this omega with like a flexible polynomial in capital and investment. That would be the Ollie-Pecos strategy. There's Levinson Petrin would do that with materials instead of with investment. The literature's kind of gone along the way. There are new versions. Ackerberg, Case, Fraser basically doing something similar to Levinson Petrin. I won't go into the great details. Sort of the last literature so far, last big paper in this literature is this Gandhi Navarro Rivers, which is basically making the point that you can't be completely flexible both about how productivity evolves and about the production function. They're not non-parametrically identified, and so they suggest using a first order condition for an additional leverage in identification. Okay, but my key point about this, the first point, is that this monotonicity assumption is very strong. And I think maybe not, there's been this weird division of labor where there's the productivity literature and people just sort of, assume whatever state of the art in productivity literature, that's what we're going to use, and they don't, question it. But what you need for these proxy variable methods to work is that there's a single dimension of heterogeneity, right? So, or scalar monotonic relationship with omega and investment or materials. So credit constraints, for instance, which those of us in this room are used to thinking of as endemic, right, would invalidate this strategy if you have heterogeneity and credit constraints across firms. If you have heterogeneity and input market frictions across firms, that would also invalidate. So the first one would invalidate Ollie-Pecos, the second would invalidate the Levinson-Petrin. Even just having firm fixed effects, if you want to control for those, typically you can't do that with these methods. These methods can't handle firm fixed effect. And I think these issues are particularly likely to be relevant in developing countries. Okay, that sort of heterogeneity is likely to be particularly relevant. Okay, second issue. Which has been highlighted by, this is a nice review paper by Jan de Loker and Penny Goldberg. It's rare to observe physical quantities. Okay, it's more typical to observe revenues. So this is now in logs. So revenues, that would be log physical output plus log output prices, or expenditures, log expenditures. That would be log material, log physical units of inputs and input prices. So then suppose that the price for a given firm would be if you think of this as a sector level price level, and then an idiosyncratic part, and then the input prices would be a sector level price level and the idiosyncratic part. You plug that back into the production function I had on the last slide. You move things around. You get the standard regression that people run, which is revenues, firm level revenues deflated by a sector level price index on firm level expenditures deflated by a sector level input price index. But then what happens is that these idiosyncratic parts end up in the error term. Okay, and that can give rise to output, what de Loker and Goldberg call output and input price biases. Okay, so for instance, if you get a demand shock, price for your goods are high, you use more inputs, that's going to break that. Then you're going to have the covariance won't be zero there. Or if when input prices are high, you use fewer inputs, that's also going to lead to a bias. Okay, so now what I think the sort of most recent turn here in this literature has been is to say, okay, given these output price and input price biases, we should go to physical quantities, which are becoming available. There are a few data sets now where you see this. Okay, so let's regress physical quantity of output on physical quantity of input. Okay, so this is a famous paper. This is Foster, Halterwanger, Severson. This is in the AER in the US data. It's now lots of people are talking about this, which generates TFPQ. You may hear that TFP quantity, right, based on quantities. That works in single input, single output industries that are homogeneous good industries, and they're basically focusing on homogeneous good industries here in these papers. I've been doing work trying to make the point, and this is building on work that by Jim Taiboot, and then also David Atkin and Amit Khandawal and Adam Osman and others have made this point that when you have quality differences, and I'm going to add when you have variety differences, then these quantity-based measures are going to be misleading also. Okay, so TFEQ, or observing physical quantities, is not going to solve the problem when you have quality differences or variety differences. So just to illustrate that, I'm going to illustrate that with a bunch of CES algebra. I hesitate to put the CES algebra. It's going to be very familiar to people who are used to working with CES. It's going to be not familiar to others. But let me just try and give you the sort of the bottom line idea. So we can think of, so now I'm going to write this now not in logs, but write this production function just as an aggregate output, okay, y tilde on an aggregate input. So why is that? Partly that's motivated by the fact that typically in data sets, even when we see quantities, we don't see the mapping from a particular input to a particular output. Okay? So here our strategy, the people who have dealt with this in different ways, our strategy is we're going to aggregate to the firm level, right, from the firm product to the firm level, right, that way, and we're going to, it's convenient to have the CES aggregation. I don't want to push too hard on the CES aggregation. It's algebraically convenient for what I'm going to show, but in fact, the results in the paper don't really depend on that aggregation. Okay, so here's where flashing up a bunch of algebra. I don't want to go in great detail, but basically, if you once you have those CES assumptions, there's lots of existing CES results that one can use. So basically, to express the log change in real output, in that y tilde, can be expressed as a sum of three terms. One is a quantity change that's called the Satya-Vartya. These are two guys who originated this in the 70s. So this is going to be an observable term. Okay, it's like a weighted average of changes, of product-specific changes. Okay, with these weights, which are a mess, which I won't go through. You can peruse at your leisure afterwards. It'd be a quality change and a variety change. Okay, that's the convenience of the CES. You can sum it as these three things. So then, that's in changes. I can take an initial normalization, sum these things up, and so I can say in levels, the log real output is going to depend on an observable piece, a quality piece, and a variety piece. Okay, exactly the same thing works on the input side. Okay, it's the exact same algebra, and again, I get to this point where the log input quantity index can be summed as an observable piece, a quality piece, and a variety piece. Okay, and so when I put those together, and I plug them back into the production function I had a few slides ago, okay, then I get something that looks like this, where that's an observable quantity output, that's an observable input, that's output quantity output, input quality output, and then other stuff, I've got a firm effect and year effect. That's totally not really crucial for what I'm about to say, but then this error term is going to contain not just the ex ante shock and the ex post shock that I talked about before, okay, it's also going to have these quality and variety terms in it. Okay, and those can generate what we call quality and variety biases. Okay, so just as an example, if we specialize to where we have a single output and a single input producer, okay, in that case, these Satya-Vartya aggregates are just going to be observed physical quantities. That'll be a physical quantity of output and physical quantity of input. Okay, but for instance, if producing higher quality output requires more labor hours, okay, that's going to generate a correlation between the number of labor hours in L, okay, and the output quality, okay. That's omitted variables bias, and we'll get a bias in the OLS coefficient there. Okay, or same thing if you use when input quality, there's a shock to input quality improves, you use more of that input, that's also going to give you a bias. Okay, now a key point here is you could have a perfect proxy for omega, right? That's what the proxy variable strategy is all about, finding a proxy for omega. You could have a perfect proxy for omega and still have these problems, right? That would not solve these problems. And then I guess I'd say, I think most sectors that we care about are not the homogeneous single input, single output sectors for which the previous methods apply, right? When you think, what are the, all the papers I'm going to talk about now, basically none of them I think are going to be characterized by homogeneous single input. Output firms are almost always multiple output, multiple input, and have quality differences. Okay, this is especially, and I think especially when you're talking about firms that are in developing countries that are entering world markets, the quality change is going to be first order. Okay, so and I'm going to I'll provide some evidence for that. So we have again, I won't go into detail here. This is our new paper. We have a sort of a competing method. We have a new method where we say let's use instruments for the input choices using exchange rates, minimum wages, and we supplement that by what's called in the literature internal instruments would be lag levels or lag differences. The jury's still out on how much influence that proposal will have, so I won't go into great detail about that. But I do think, I guess the point for this talk is that I think that standard TFP methods are on pretty shaky ground, especially for in differentiated product sectors. As I said, the intuition will go through, if you don't have CES, our results are similar whether we have CES or not. And it's not, this quality variety bias is not just a theoretical curiosity. So I'm gonna talk about that shortly. So now, happily, a growing, or think about what's the way forward. Happily, I think a number of papers are sort of showing us the way forward. Several are going to mention below where we've paid the shoe leather costs, have gotten to these direct measures of upgrading and not just relying on TFP. I think that I would put this, this literature on management practices, which is generally a very, a great thing, that people are observing management practices much more carefully, right? So that's observing, you can think of a technique very carefully. And the World Bank has been conducting technology surveys, going around with particular sectors, asking about what actual machines the firms are using. That's going to stimulate, it's a working paper, and then there's now a book coming, on the World Bank website. So that's, I think, going to stimulate a lot of work in the area. So that's quite promising. And so I think my view is that the way forward is going to be find settings that combine, where we have direct measures of upgrading and credibly exogenous variation in factors that affect firms' upgrading decisions. Okay, but we do have to be careful, as back to my point about not the vertical view, we're not sure, what if technology is good. We do have to be careful in interpreting these results when we're using these direct measures, about, is this, we shouldn't automatically assume that if someone's not upgrading that they're somehow making a mistake or they're not optimizing. Okay, so, all right, I made it through the productivity thing. All right, so now let's go to the actual, evidence on drivers of upgrading. And I'll start on the output side. So I think a robust lesson that's emerging from this literature is that selling to richer consumers, which could be directly by exporting or indirectly by selling into value chains that sell eventually to richer consumers, is associated with upgrading, especially with quality upgrading, but also other forms of upgrading. So there were some early papers. There were some TFP papers that kind of had mixed results. I've worked a lot in this area, mainly using prices and quantities rather than direct measures. Had a little bit of a ISO 9000 or whatever, but not very much. But the recent work I think has made a lot of progress on the measures and on clean identification as well. Okay, I'm going to talk about a paper. This is probably familiar to many of you, the Egyptian rugs paper. David Etkin and kind of Adam Osman. But it ties together a number of the themes I'm trying to talk about, and so I think it's worth spending some time on it. So they, working with an NGO, they randomly allocated initial export orders to these Egyptian rug producers, typically pretty small, okay, typically not exporting. And they also tracked detailed quality indicators, okay, of the rugs that those guys were producing. They kept track of, I won't talk more about this, but I think in a very nice aspect, they kept track of the conversation between the buyer and the intermediary for the buyer and the producers. And then they had brought people into a laboratory and had them weave identical specification rugs. Okay, so this is just one table from that. Here we have the intent to treat, treatment untreated for guys who took up this order. These are a bunch of different quality metrics which they had measured by local experts essentially. And so, here I'm reaching the boundaries of my knowledge about rugs, but basically how the corners, the waviness, weight, touch, packedness, warp thread tightness, these are all indicators of the quality of rugs. Those went up. Okay, so these guys started producing higher quality rugs. Their inputs also went up. This would be like the inputs here is the quality of the threads, the price of the threads went up as well. Okay, so it seems clear that there's quality upgrading in response to this, in response to exporting. Profits went up. Okay, again, that's maybe not surprising. These guys are doing better. Their direct profit is measured in various ways. There's direct profit. They can do revenues minus costs. They constructed a forum. They did hypothetical profits. What if this happened? Anyway, any way you slice it, it looks like profits went up. Not surprising. This was a good thing for these firms. Productivity went down. Okay, so productivity, either if you measure it as unadjusted output per hour, okay, or unadjusted TFP, controlling for capital stock. Basically what's happening is these guys, they get an order, produce high quality rug, they take more time doing that, and they produce fewer square meters of rug. Okay, so I think this is, it's hard to imagine a cleaner example of the problems with the TFP measures. And why it's just very clear this is a good thing for the firms, they're more profitable, producing higher quality in various ways, but the TFP is going to give you exactly the wrong answer on this. Okay, and then, so not only now, in previous work, I had modeled, partly for convenience, this quality upgrading is just a shift that didn't have learning involved, basically. It was just a shift between products that firms already knew how to produce. Okay, it's just shifting weights of the output weights. But a point here, which I think is a very nice point about this paper, is that no, the producers seem to be learning something in the process of doing that. Okay, and the way they figure that out is they say, okay, let's go and do identical specification, or there's a couple of ways, but the one that I think is most convincing is they say, take the, we're going to sew identical specification rugs in the laboratory, okay, and they find that the guys who got the treatment, right, are producing higher quality rugs, even though the specifications were the same. The rugs that they actually produced were higher quality, and they took no longer, right? So the time was the same, but they're producing higher quality stuff, which it looks like an increase in capability, which we would call learning. So that was the point I made before. I was just talking about shifts of band curves, but here there's actually accumulation of lambdas. I think an interesting question, that comes out of this paper is it just capabilities involved in producing the sorts of rugs that like rich European or rich American buyers want, or is that sort of a generalized increase in knowledge? I think we're not quite sure from this paper, and so that would be an interesting thing for people to try to investigate. Okay, let me go another paper that's sort of in the similar spirit. Jonas is here. The paper, and you're in the ad also. So a paper on Peruvian fish meal mills. Okay, where they have a neat strategy. So the advantage here is they observe in the data. There's a quality indicator in the data. Okay, the quality of the fish meal that these guys are producing. And then they have a nice strategy where they're using quotas in the main competitors that are producing high quality fish meal, okay, which would be Denmark, Iceland, Chile. And when the quotas are binding, then that's going to increase demand for fish meal from Peru. Okay, and here they find a very interesting outcome is that these mills buy boats. Basically, they vertically integrate with a fisherman. Fisher people, I guess I should, mostly men, I'm guessing. Okay, so that they buy those. So I mean, the concept of the framework would be they're using a different technique, okay, that has a different set of inputs and producing higher quality meal, fish meal. The idea there, which they have evidence of, the nice thing about it, they can actually see where the boats go, which is extraordinary. And the integrated boats stay closer to port and they deliver smaller loads of fish, which are both associated with having fresher fish. Okay, so the freshness of the fish is not observable at the point of transaction, and so this is a way that they can sort of ensure the supply of high quality fish meal. Okay, so I think that sort of points to an interesting direction for this literature to go, is very relevant to or sort of in the wheelhouse of development economics, which is, there are contracting frictions, right? There's asymmetric information, there's contracting frictions that may constrain the ability of firms to upgrade. Okay, so in this case, the firms actually were able to vertically integrate and upgrade, but there may be other firms that are not able to do that and hence would be constrained by the fact that they can't get the high quality fish meal. And so I think that's another very promising direction to try and go in, is how the interactions between contracting frictions and these upgrading decisions may be driven by sort of I'd say like demand pull for quality. So Isabella's here someplace, right? Okay, so I want to talk about this, another great paper by Alfaro Ureña, also in the et al., Isabella and Jose Vasquez. So this is where they have, so I think the firm-to-firm data, which we're getting from VAT systems or from tax systems, this is an important, a very important expansion of the data frontier. I think it's going to stimulate a lot of work on this firm stuff. So they have such data from Costa Rica. They can look at firms, they're basically comparing firms that start selling domestically to a multinational corporation against firms that don't start selling. They might start selling to a domestic corporation, or they have various control groups, basically. So you can imagine that's a picture of the Intel factory in Costa Rica. And they find that, so guys, and so it's important to have the firm-to-firm, because before we didn't know, we couldn't ever see this, who was selling to a domestic multinational corporation before. Okay, and they find sales of these new suppliers to MNCs, employment, TFP, measured in traditional ways, go up relative to new MNC suppliers. And I think, for me, my favorite, I haven't said this to Isabella, but my favorite results here are about what's the characteristics of the other buyers, the non-MNC buyers that these firms are selling to, okay? And so basically they end up selling, after they start supplying to the MNC, their other buyers tend to be larger, are more likely to export and import, have longer relationships with suppliers. You can see this here. This is like comparing, so the green dots would be guys who start supplying to MNCs. And then this would be domestic exporters, which would be, it's all already pretty good, pretty large firms. And this is now, that's how much sales to others. You see it looks like there's capacity constraints in the short term. When they start selling to Intel, their sales to other firms go down. They just don't have arguably they don't have the capacity. But then pretty quickly, their sales are higher. It looks like, I think it's convincing, the authors argue, and they have qualitative data to support this, it looks like these MNC suppliers, new MNC suppliers, learned and got a reputational boost basically from selling to these MNCs. So that seems sort of in line with this idea that who you sell to matters, and selling to sort of rich country buyers, directly or indirectly, seems to matter. This is commonly perceived to be a key driver of upgrading. And including within firms, so not just allocation across firms, but within firms. There's obviously some nice examples of that. There's a paper by Das et al. Colin Christian is also on this paper, where there was a public sector rail mill which had a monopoly on selling rails to the Indian railroads, and then the government considered allowing others to enter in basically in 1999, 2001, and it became sort of binding, or the salience rose in 2001, and you can see that the output of these rails relative to these structural shifts will be sort of non-rail items in the same factory, and this was output per shift just shot up. So at some point, the threat of entry seems to have gotten this factory producing more quickly. So clearly competition can matter, so the theory is not obvious. First of all, why was this firm, in the case, this case was a monopoly selling to a public sector, but typically it's not obvious why a firm would not be already optimizing, right? So why do you need competition in order to get firms to optimize? And then I think the evidence is less than definitive. So Holmes and Schmitz have a nice review. Basically, it's hard to tell empirically the effect of killing off poor performers from a within firm upgrading effect of competition. Okay, so basically you've got to be very careful about that, right? So if you look at competition, you look like average productivity goes up. That may just be because you're not seeing the guys were killed off for whom that didn't happen. Recca Uhas also has a nice paper where this is the historical one, but Napoleon blockade was more binding in the north than in the south, and so firms in the north of France were able to reap scale economies and productivity rose more quickly. And then a paper by Rocco Macchiavello and Amit Morjaria. I think it's a very nice one, which is in a second best world where there are contracting frictions, then it's not obvious that competition is going to sort of increase efficiency. So basically what they're finding is, this is in Rwanda with coffee mills. They have an engineering model, given the ruggedness of the Rwandan geography, sort of arguing about they construct an instrument for how many other mills are going to be nearby, okay? In places that have, and then they show that it predicts, how many other mills are nearby. And so in mills that have other mills nearby, they see fewer investments in relational contracts. Okay, so this would be like, and they asked on the suppliers and the mills themselves, did you receive an input from the mill ahead of time, to the mill, did you give inputs to farmers? Did they have delayed payment, which is some sort of trust on the other side? These are sort of indicators of trust, look like they're weaker. Okay, which is interesting and striking, and they also find that quality falls with competition. So that's just to say, this is a note of caution. I think that competition is one of those things. I think people come out and say, "Oh yeah, competition is driving upgrading." I'm not so sure. Okay, 15 minutes. Okay, all right. Let me go. So input side drivers. So far I've been talking about what I call demand pull drivers, like selling. Who the buyers are matters for how much upgrading there is. The question would be, can there be input push? Does the supply of input somehow matter as well? There's some existing work there. Maybe I won't say very much about it, but it's like in China, when import tariffs went down, it looks like export prices went up, which suggests that some firms are able to import higher quality inputs. They sell higher quality outputs. I want to tell you briefly about, with one slide, a new project where we're trying to support this as the end of the alphabet person. We're trying to support this new norm. I didn't go so well for me this time, but I'm hopeful that I'll eventually get out there in the front. Okay, so that what we did is we've been working with soccer ball producers in Pakistan for a long time, we randomized the vouchers for a high-quality imported version of the main material, which is called Rexin, this artificial leather. And then we looked at how people, what people did on other dimensions. These are basically IV models where now the voucher was the same dollar amount, and so it was a bigger effect for smaller firms than for larger firms. So we're using like the interaction of the size and the treatment. That's the instrument for this, whether you used eligible Rexin in producing your ball. But basically, the point here is that when firms got these subsidies, they improved on lots of dimensions, not just the Rexin dimension. So they used better Rexin, which is sort of not surprising, but they also use better latex as kind of the glue to glue the Rexin to the layers of cotton or polyester they have. They used the number of layers of the cotton or polyester. And then, not significantly, but this is the type of bladder, this is a better type of bladder, and then we have whether the bladder is imported or not. And so if you put those into an index, you find that's significant. And then if you can do that, that's in terms of physical quality, which we're observing, and you can also do it in terms of costs. Okay, so if they got this voucher, their bladder cost went up, this is the glue stuff cost went up, costs went up on various other dimensions as well. And so I'll have to refer you to, the paper doesn't exist, but it's coming out shortly, or it'll be posted shortly. But essentially, so overall costs actually went up, right? In response to getting this voucher, overall costs went up. Even though we just tweaked that one price. There wasn't any general income effects, it was just that one price you see. And so you actually have, pass-through is negative, right? So it looks like, your price goes down, and so that's going to screw up any pass-through regressions. But I think if you have this upgrading idea in mind, then it's clear what's happening, right? It's just that they're upgrading on various dimensions. You can think of this as input quality complementarities. Having better high quality inputs on one side leads to higher quality inputs on the other side. Okay. Let me just, I'm conscious of time, let me just briefly say, I was expecting, somewhat surprisingly, in writing this review, I didn't find a lot of evidence that supply of capital matters for upgrading outcomes, right? Which those outcomes that elicit learning or technology adoption or product innovation, right? So now, there's some nice papers. So this is Martin Roneberg, Nathalie Bau and Matre. Neither of them is explicitly focused on this, but they do have, research designs that allow them to say something about the effect of capital on outcomes. They're both not looking at TFPQ. They don't find about much on TFPQ. Bau and Matre do find something on adding products. That's this one. Okay, and this is a paper by Jinkai and Ann Harrison. There was a VAT reduction on capital goods in China that increased investment, but not product innovations or productivity. Okay, so that's somewhat surprising to me. So here, the concerns about TFP estimation would apply to when they're using TFPQ. So I think that's an area where and some new research would be welcome, but it looks, at least so far, it looks like we don't have a lot of evidence that supply of capital per se matters for innovation. Okay, let me move on. Let's go through to now drivers of know-how. So let's say, so far I've talked about external conditions, output demand conditions, input supply conditions. I think we can imagine situations where output demand and input supply conditions seem to be favorable and firms still fail to upgrade. Our framework would point to lack of know-how, right? So that firms may not have the capabilities, or they may just not know about the products or the techniques. So I'm going to talk about, time permitting, I'm going to talk about 4 different areas where I think we're learning something about sort of barriers or drivers of upgrading. One was HCSU. So okay. Many of you have probably heard me talk about this paper, the soccer ball paper. I don't want to say very much, talk about it at length. Basically, we came up with a new technology for these soccer ball guys. It was a way of cutting pentagons that reduced the weights of the Rex in the main material using something that mathematicians knew. We gave it out. Very few firms adopted, right? And the argument was that the misalignment of incentives within firms can impede information flows and hence learning. So basically the cutters, the guys who were actually doing the cutting, were paid piece rates. They didn't have it, the new technology slowed them down, which reduced their incomes, and so they found ways to block it. Okay? And it wasn't until then we gave them an incentive, explicit incentive to adopt. We said, hey, we'll give you a month's salary as a bonus if you can demonstrate this technology works. They did that, and the firms adopted. So I think it's an example of how sort of agency issues within organizations can impede the flow of information and sort of impede the accumulation of know-how. Another paper, maybe this one's less well known, it's just coming out. It's Jinkai and Xingyi Wang have a very nice paper on, this is a Chinese auto manufacturer, internal within a single manufacturer. So basically they implemented a new policy where employees' evaluations of their supervisors were taken into account heavily with 20% weight in the salary decisions for the supervisors. Okay, so that they, the employees, unsurprisingly, reported that the supervisors became nicer. And then, so team level productivity increased, essentially because there was less turnover. It reduced turnover. It didn't have a lot of effect on individual productivity, but it did have effect, reduced turnover. Team level productivity increased. And then the proof that was in the pudding, in the sense that the firm started with just a little pilot program, rolled it out through all their factories. So now, I think there's different interpretation we could have of this paper, but to me it suggests that this evaluation system led to an information flow from lower level workers to upper level management about what the middle level managers were doing, right, in a good way, right? And so then these guys were being abusive, or these guys were being annoying, and so that this led to a mechanism where that stopped happening, and people were happier and more productive. An interesting question is, why didn't firms, these are all within the firm stuff, why don't firms figure this out on their own? I think there are a couple of different possibilities. One is that firms were just not aware of the new practice. They just didn't have the knowledge. It wasn't in their, it wasn't in their that capital K thing that they of techniques that they knew about. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that firms were aware, but that there are recontracting costs that outweighed the expected benefits. So actually, that's my preferred interpretation of in our soccer ball case, is that even if firms knew that they incentivized workers to share this information, they might have gotten more information. They said, well, if I do that, then they're going to want, they're going to want a bonus every time they do something else, and it's going to be a hassle, and so they didn't want to do it, based on their sort of low perception that the technology was going to pay off. I'm not sure if this one may have been just that the firm was just not aware. And so I think actually that's another good topic for research is, what do firms, if you see firms failing to adopt, like ask them why not? What is it, what do they believe the costs and benefits are, and try and bring that out. Okay. All right. So another big topic, sort of, when you think about barriers to upgrading, would be, or a barrier to upgrade would be a lack of entrepreneurial ability. And then a lot of that's related to, family control. Like, why is it that there seem to be some managers who are not particularly good who've inherited, control of their firm from a previous generation. So there's, lots of work showing this is sort of cross-sectionally, basically, that managers do differ in their practices, and those are associated with productivity differences. So there's a nice new paper. This is Oriana Bandeira and Andrea Pratt and Rafael Sudun and somebody, and this is Ach, and Anand was here yesterday. And others sort of showing that correlation. There's also, I think, strong evidence that, it's correlational evidence or event study evidence that when control is passed to the next generation, that those firms have worse performance. And then also this is, Bloom and Marino point out that they have less structured practice. I mean, sort of the practices that score lower on the World Management Survey that they run. There's this. I think the evidence is strong here that this kind of succession does have negative effects, and the strongest evidence are these child composition IVs. So you can look at whether the gender of the firstborn of the CEO or of whether the CEO has any son, and that predicts whether the control is passed within the firm, and then family succession is associated with lower profitability, worse performance, and lowering management scores. So that's, I think, pretty clear. I don't think we should conclude from that, though, that like family control is bad. We should just never have family control. Because I think it's important to realize, like, again, in the spirit of figuring out what problem is being solved, I think family control helps to solve many of these agency problems. So family control helps solve some of these. You can sort of trust your family members. A larger span of control, arguably. So Pakistani circle firms that had more brothers were larger. Family, they are offered lower power incentives. And so I think the way I think I would interpret this is that family control solves some problems, right, that then outlive their usefulness. Right, so they solve problems when the CEO is in play. You have the dynamic, charismatic CEO, right? But then once that person dies, and then they outlive the usefulness. In the same way, actually, so peace rates in the soccer ball example do a similar thing. Peace rates were a good thing. Obviously, they were optimal before a new technology came to town. It was just once the new technology came to town, they got in the way, right? And so it's sort of somewhat more subtle than just like families are bad interpretation. Okay. What was it? So. How many people are going to have questions? Nobody. Okay, Dean's going to have a question. A couple questions. Okay. let's see, what can I say? So I'll just say there's, sorry to Guy and Seidel and the next paper. So there's lots of evidence that firms can learn from other firms. They have a very nice paper in China. There's good evidence that firms can learn from trainers and consultants. There's a sort of accumulation of evidence there. There's some frontier issues I was going to talk about. Maybe I'll say this might be a good topic of conversation and something to stimulate a few more questions, which is, so I've emphasized a lack of know-how as the barrier to upgrading here, right? That if firms, it looks like, firms should be doing adopting some technology or producing some product, they're not doing it. Why is it? It's arguing that it seems like they might not have the know-how. It's also possible, obviously, that they have some other goal, that the entrepreneurs have some other goal besides profit maximization, or that they're making mistakes. And so, we definitely need more evidence about that. So Michael and Gautam and Frank, I guess, have a chapter on behavioral development economics where they have a section on behavioral firms that basically say we don't know that much about the motivations of entrepreneurs. We need to find out more about that. And I heartily, support that. I do have a word of caution, which is I think, especially sometimes in these management discussions, that there's a tendency to say, oh yeah, people are just making mistakes, and if they just had McKinsey or whoever it was, consulting them, then things would be better. And I think that there's a tendency to sort of jump too quickly to that conclusion, right? So there was the old Schultz idea, like we think of people as agricultural producers as poor but rational, right? We should try to understand the problem they face. I think we should update for LDC firms. We should think of firms as lacking know-how but populated by rational individuals. And so firms may not make optimizing decisions, but arguably many individuals. I think that the evidence so far is largely consistent with the idea that individuals are maximizing on their own. And so what looks like non-profit maximizing behavior would often look like, I think would often be explained by agency or contracting or organizational issues and or the cost of acquiring know-how rather than just making mistakes or holding other objectives. Okay. Okay, summing up. So I think it's a stronger way of saying this. I think it's time to move on from TFP as the main metric for estimating upgrading. I think we should go, pay the shoe leather costs, go out and find these direct measures. I think that's the way forward. Some drivers said this before, selling rich consumers, availability of high quality inputs, ability to resolve contracting frictions, exposure to other firms and trainers and consultants are all important. A key challenge, I think, is how to promote learning in firms. There were some notes of caution on competition on capital and behavioral firms. But I guess the big message is I do think it's possible to do credible work in this area, and you all should go out and start doing it. I think these are important questions, and I hope basically that this work on firms won't just be, like trade macro IO that has some application in developing countries, but that they'll actually be seen as inherently an organic part of development economics. Okay, I'll stop there, and so we can take a couple questions.